think we have a terrific person today. I met him, I don't know, 15 years ago or something like this in Berlin, when he was still doing other things, and he's had a stellar career since then. And many guest professorships, and I won't mention them. Let me just talk about a couple or three of the books: A Comparative Study of the WPA and the Reichsarbeitsdienst, which is transnational history. It's the best kind, and that was okay, and it's a while back. Other people also get older. That's a surprise. The second dissertation, if I have it right, is the Common Agricultural Policy. And I have actually read most of it, which puts me into class by myself. Because it's a highly technical work. To be recommended, but it is not easy going. And then one of my colleagues has done a work on the European worldwide, globally. And that again shows a kind of intellectual reach, which is beyond most of us. And institutionally, he has been in Florence, he has been at Maastricht, which of course is also a symbolic place. If you do European studies, it's a real place, and one that fits on another level. And he is on his way to Munich, where he's just gotten image. And tonight he will talk about Project Europa, Project Europe, and he will offer a historical critique of some of the myths that surround European integration. And you can probably sort of let one of these circulate. That is the German of the book. Let's all welcome Kiran.
Konrad, thank you very much for this kind introduction and the invitation to be here. I'm thrilled. There is many colleagues, friends from different contexts, people who I haven't met so far, so I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to you here about the European Union and its history, if there is anything of that kind. And I want to convince you that it's really worth looking into that history, even if it sometimes becomes very technical and dull, if you will. There is something we should be aware of. You could say that for the longest time, most Europeans have thought that, again, the history of the European Union is extremely grey, dull, boring, the kind of weather we had this morning probably, at least when I arrived here. But I would argue that, and that is probably also what you've seen over the past years, that finally there is drama in European integration history. These are two pictures that probably you've seen over the past years. This is on the one hand Kiev 2013, the Maidan Square, where people were not only waving their Ukrainian flags, but also the EU flag to say, well, this is really where we want to be part of. This is where we want to be part of the European project. Then on the other hand, you have the other extreme also with Athens 2014, just 1 year later. This is, of course, the austerity policies of the European Union, and people then burning the flag of the European Union to show their discontent with this Europe of the European Union, and what it has been doing to them, basically. The funny thing is, and this is probably easy to understand for those of you who've been around for more than 30 years on this planet already, but I hope also that the others would understand this point, that 30 years ago, these pictures would have been inconceivable for people, because the very image, the very symbol of the European Union, that blue flag with the 12 golden stars, was only introduced in the European Union in 1986. And only since then has started to become ever more visible and ubiquitous in European politics, whereas before that there were symbols also of various kinds, but they basically didn't matter that much. And it is funny that originally that symbol of the flag belonged to another organization on top. It was the Council of Europe that introduced that symbol for itself in the first place. And it was then only after some 30 years, again 55 in the Council of Europe, 86 in the European Communities, again the predecessor of today's European Union, introduced in the organization that we today associate with this symbol. So, if you will, this little story I think tells us several things. Firstly, I would argue that it is quite difficult to get hold of the EU's past, because these images and the present have imposed themselves on the longer experience of European integration, and make it sometimes difficult to step beyond the immediate years, the last years, to go back into that earlier period where, again, you could say, well, we know very little about that dull grey period where the EU wasn't so much on kind of making headlines and when there was so much drama. Secondly, I would argue that again it is interesting if you just look at that little symbol there, that you need to broaden the scope and the canvas, and you need to also look at other international organizations to eventually understand how the European Union came to become such an important player organization as it is today, very obviously. And thirdly, if you will, that also we have to put distance between ourselves and the narratives that Eurosceptics and Europhiles, kind of pro-European people, have themselves projected on the European Union and its past. So the idea of this talk is really to provide something that you could call a critical approach to European integration history. And this is what I would like to invite you to. This is what this book is about. Again, unfortunately, so far there is only a version in German. I hope there will be an English version soon. I'm just negotiating with publishers. So if you write to them after this talk, that will certainly help to convince them to bring this out soon. The funny thing is that the European Union has had a history of some 70 years, you could say. But amongst historians, there's been comparably little interest in the past of the European Union. Again, there are some very notable exceptions in this room of scholars who've dealt with that past, but I would argue that most historians in contemporary history, European history, have really thought that this is a very marginal topic. And also this is the idea of this talk, to show really that there is something that is worth looking further into. And with the presentation, I'd like to do three things. So firstly, I would like to put the project of European integration, the EU, as it emerged from early organizations, into a broader context of other international organizations. So this is a little bit also what I started to introduce already with that symbol. And I would then, again, after contextualizing and maybe even decentering it in that way, still like to ask ourselves, or myself firstly, why it actually became then the prominent, such a prominent and actually also dominant form of international organization. And again, going beyond the international organizations that you also have in Western Europe and Europe altogether. And the third thing is then to do what the book that is circulated around the room is mainly asking, and that is not so much looking into the international negotiations around European integration. This is, of course, highly important, has been done by others before, but rather ask what did European integration bring to citizens in the community and beyond. So that is the third part that I will want to discuss with you today. So that brings me already to the first part, and again, if you will, to stress the point that there was more than one Europe, if you will, at the time when European integration started, and not only because there was various ideas, also because there were several European organizations that all, by and large, tried to do similar things. And this is a little bit the context that I want to introduce you firstly here today. Because the starting point, I think, also in quite a little bit of literature, also amongst the few historians who've written about this topic, is that nation states post-45 basically had two options. They could, on the one hand, go for a nation-centered, if you will, a traditional Westphalian, as the political scientists would call it, approach. That is the standard story of national sovereignty, or again, they could opt for European integration, EU, or again, predecessor EC, European Community style. I would argue that instead, this is true, but there were also many other options, and that we should not see the EC or EU as the main alternative to national sovereignty at the time, that also in Western Europe, and that is what I will concentrate on in this presentation today, the EC-EU was rather a fragile latecomer at the stage of international organization, and that was a stage of international organizations that was already quite densely populated. So it was not, again, the only alternative to a nation-centered form of policy making. So when the ECSC, and I'm sorry that I will have to sometimes go back and use these acronyms for these organizations. I know that some of you have already been trained by Gary and Lisbeth in these all kind of acronyms and organizations, so I hope you will be able to bear with me. This is again the earliest predecessor of today's European Union. It's the Coal and Steel Community, which was created in 1953. I would argue it was the result of a learning curve already. A learning curve that, of course, stretches back also into the 19th century, into the interwar years. But if, for the sake of time, I only concentrate on the few years since 1945, it was mainly the result of 3 lessons that were drawn from these 7 years or so, 5 years, basically prior to the first discussions about this new organization. And the 3 lessons were the following. Firstly, to go for a rather small geographical scope with rather homogeneous member states only. Secondly, to go for low politics instead for high politics. And thirdly, for a rather intense form of integration. And to just elaborate a little bit on each of these 3 points, I think it's good to remind ourselves how first efforts of integration at the international level in Europe look like. And I would imagine that even some of you who've read quite a bit already on European integration might not have heard of the first organization that was set up post-45 to organize Europe's international politics, which was an organization that exists until today, and it's called the UNE-CE, it's the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, set up in 1947. And I'm giving you here the list of member states because it is quite interesting that this was set up with 7 member states, it's 18 states altogether, from Western Europe, but also several member states, or countries I should say, from Eastern Europe, that's Czechoslovakia, Poland for instance, and also included the 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. So this organization, this thing, if you will, was set up to continue the wartime alliance, also against fascism and Nazism, and the idea was to use this to reconstruct Europe in that post-war period. It was therefore a pan-European organization that really was still hoping that the new tensions between East and West could be controlled. And as we all know, looking back from today, the Cold War fully kicked in just a few months later after this had been set up. And this is the reason why this attempt is basically forgotten, even if there is still civil servants making their careers and good money serving on this organization until today. So if you then look from here to the very end of this process again, you see an organization, again, this coal and steel community, the earliest predecessor of today's European Union, that is then very different in kind. It does reflect already very clearly the Cold War divide, hence you only have Western European countries. You also have only those who really firmly associate themselves with the political West of the United States. So what you have in this short period, again 47 until 1950, again this was the Schuman Plan that then led to the Treaty of 51-52, is that it was clear that you had to choose your sides basically, and that you now only had Western European countries working together, also neutral states not being part of this organization anymore. And what is also remarkable, of course, is that West Germany, the Federal Republic that had just been established the year before, was now seen as a full-blown member state. Obviously, that would not have been possible in 1947, but in some of these earlier organizations, the idea was also really to control Germany and to contain it much more than to see it as an equal member state of these new attempts. So in that sense, I would argue that this is really a very different world, and there is a learning curve at this level of saying, well, you want to go for a small geographical scope, you are living in a Cold War world, and you want to have homogeneous member states, because of course these are all democratic capitalist countries that are comparably rich if you compare them with other countries at the time across Europe and beyond. Secondly, I would argue that, again, the ECEC did not just clearly reflect the Cold War divides with neutrals kept out, but also, again, this dimension of high versus low politics. Because there is this organization, some of you might have heard about it, the Brussels Pact, which was later morphing into the West European Union, which was about high politics. This was a security organization, and the idea here, where it was set up, was again to contain Germany. And it did reflect already the Cold War divide, so you have only Western European countries as part of this organization. But it was, again, still very different from what is going on in this other context over there. So again, you have this organization, you have NATO, which I don't list here because of course it goes far beyond Western Europe, which then, as we all know, becomes much more important than the Brussels Pact. It was mainly then that security issues for Western Europe were organized in a transatlantic context, with the United States as benevolent hegemon and with NATO again as the main forum. The ECSC, again, this organization here that I mentioned there, tried to also become active in this field. Some of you who know the history of the European integration process well know this, that there were these plans to add to this organization on coal and steel a new or two new treaties, one on political cooperation, one on military defense issues, but those failed in 1954. So there were plans, but there was this lesson that this didn't really work out, and from then on, you remained mainly for a long period in the low politics field and didn't go back to the high politics context. And it is interesting that again, this, if you will, secondary role, that it wasn't really dealing with the most pressing issues, the security concerns of the era, where again, there was a new global conflict starting, but rather with, if you will, more mundane technical economic issues, is also interesting because it wasn't the only organization doing that at the time. Some historians would argue there were as many as 20 other organizations in West Europe alone that also dealt with these economic issues. One of them, for instance, being the OEEC. This is the predecessor of today's OECD, which was set up in 1948, part of the Marshall Plan, but then also created its own dynamics and moved into new directions. But again, it is to say that, if you will, you have these dynamics of focusing on low politics and continuing to have this economic focus. And then thirdly, if you will, from 3 points that I mentioned, it is again about the form of integration. I've already mentioned that there were fewer states, that the questions at stake were less crucial in comparison to other organizations. But again, and this is again paradoxical, if you will, that the new organizations that were set up then, the coal and steel communities and the later organizations that then came to form the EU, had greater powers, and greater legal powers particularly. Some of you will know this big distinction between intergovernmentalism, where ultimate power remains with the member states, and on the other hand, a more supranational approach to integration and cooperation, where states surrender parts of their serenity to a higher authority, and then sometimes at least accept to have legally binding majority decisions with immediate effect. And again, that is the tendency, the latter tendency, the supranational tendency that is closely associated with the coal and steel community. And it was also part of the DNA of the two next organizations that were built up and that were added to this organization with the same set of member states. That is the Treaty of Rome organizations of 1957, Euratom on the one hand, and the European Economic Community on the other hand. I would, however, not want to overemphasize the difference between them, because it is important to add that in the first years, these supranational components were not very clearly kind of anchored in the organization. It was not least of all decisions by the European Court of the 1960s that gave them more space. And of course, there were always also intergovernmental elements in the three communities that came to form the European community, next to the more supranational dimensions. So there is another organization that one could add, the Council of Europe, which is another example of an organization that to some extent was more dealing with high politics because it was in charge of human rights issues, which again shows us that the EC, the predecessor of the European Union, was only one among many. And again, this kind of chart could be much longer even, by bringing in many more. And where I would argue that again, it stands as kind of comes in as a latecomer and as the result of this long learning curve of organizations. And the interesting thing is that if you read a history textbook, what you often find is that these organizations are briefly mentioned, right? They're mentioned up to the point of the early 1950s, and then they drop out of the picture, as if they had died or become irrelevant. But again, also for those of you who might be Europeans and look for jobs around Brussels or elsewhere, they all continue to exist, right? And they all continue to hire people. And that is quite interesting that they were not, again, discontinued once the EC was set up. And I think that is a stark reminder that the success, if you will, that the EC/EU would become the most dominant, the most important forum, was far from clear. I would also argue that in the early 1960s, it was quite unclear whether, for instance, the OECD, that's then the successor of the OEC, or the EC would become the more important forum of European cooperation and integration. So they all overlapped, they partly also competed with each other, and this is, if you will, the trial and error approach that characterized policymaking in Europe at the time. So this is, if you will, the first step that I wanted to discuss with you, talking about the stage, where again the EC was only one of several players, and by no means the obvious winner of this race of becoming the foremost forum of European cooperation and integration. And this brings me directly to the second point that I would like to discuss with you, and that is the big question, why then, if you will, did the EC rise to become the foremost, the most important, if you will, even the dominant forum of European cooperation and integration over the course of several decades? Again, referring to the historical research, I would argue, well, there isn't so much of interest in this question so far. Many historians have been more busy looking into the questions of the motives of European integration, and then rather technical discussions, again, of the various steps that were taken. But the rather big factors, if you will, that then drove the process over several decades have not attracted so much attention. And I would, again, to keep it short and succinct, I'd like to highlight three factors that I would argue are particularly important to understand why the EU, or the EC again, particularly in the Cold War context, was then becoming the foremost forum. And again, for better and for worse. So this is more a description and analysis than a normative statement, obviously. The first point that I would like to make has to do with and this is firstly, I should have shown that to you a second ago already, just to show that this is a maze. So also, if you found the last slide confusing with all these different acronyms and organizations, you're not alone. This is what it was all about. This is the trial and error approach, basically, that was about creating this multiplicity of organizations where they, again, sometimes cooperated and competed with each other, and I'll also come back to that point later on in my talk. Now, going back, again, as I just started to say, to the three main points, basically, of why the EC starts to become a different kind of animal in comparison to these other organizations. I would want to argue that it has to do with its economic focus and certain forms of spillover effects. Now, those of you who are political scientists will already think they know exactly what I'm going to say. I want to modify that argument a little bit, as you will see in a moment. But let me start with the economic dimension. I want to argue that, again, the very fact that the EU was busy, or EC, I should say again, to be historically correct, with low politics issues, and particularly with economic issues, helped it to gain relevance over time. What do I mean with this? Again, it didn't really try to enter those issues that really were of utmost importance, like, again, human rights, like security issues, because there the resistance of member states probably would have been too big. This is also what, for instance, the Council of Europe experience stands for. And hence, if you will, it was able to occupy itself with issues of secondary quality and importance in the first decades of its existence, and that also gave it time to develop itself with its economic focus. So the economic DNA, I think, is utterly important. And let me now talk a little bit about these spillover effects for which these glasses, if you will, could serve as a metaphor. Let me use, Konrad was already kind enough to mention that my little expertise in common agriculture policy history, that's the agricultural leg of European integration, which was very important in the first decades of European integration history, where you had these market organizations. So this was by and large a rather protectionistic policy, which was setting up market routes and also fixed prices for certain commodities. And you started out with the most important ones, like cereals, but then also meat and vegetables and so on. And there was a certain tendency, once you did that, that also those who grew wines or olives or other small things, basically, that were first considered to be marginal, rice, for instance, were also asking for these forms of intervention that secured their kind of prices and made their lives as farmers comparatively easy. So there is a certain tendency, if you will, within the economic realm to jump from one step to the other. And I would argue that there were also other steps of this kind. For instance, to fields that in the beginning were rather mentioned in the Treaties of Rome as exceptions to what the European Economic Community, which then became the most important of the three communities, should actually do. One example would be culture, for instance. Culture, well, what is culture? Nobody knows. But the idea was that cultural artifacts, that is what you read in the Treaties of Rome, should be excluded from the normal economic focus of the community. But over time, there were ideas, well, what do we do with artists, right? If they want to work from Belgium in France or the other way around, right? Do we have to have special routes for them? What do we do with cultural artifacts? And hence, again, this economic logic and rationale jumped into other fields. And that is also something one could demonstrate for hygiene, for environmental policies, and so on. My point is now, and that is very important to me, that these things did not happen automatically. So those of you who know their Haas will not see me as a Haas kind of revivalist here who will want to make his case here. I would want to argue that there was always this potential, and then it took specific actors who would then have to push for these kind of issues, and sometimes were successful and sometimes weren't. Again, from specific member states, from the parliament, from the commission. But again, if you zoom out from the EC story itself and compare it to the Council of Europe or to the Western European Union or other organizations, where you also had actors trying to push for an increase of policy fields that these organizations were busy with, you see them being much less successful. And I would argue that it had to do, again, with the low salience, the economic focus, why this was comparatively more successful than if you were, for instance, in charge of security issues or, for instance, in charge of human rights issues. So that is the argument here. So it's a very light form, if you will, of functional, neo-functionalism, and hopefully different enough from the old form to make it also not deterministic and mechanic as an argument. Secondly, I would argue, again, there is law. And I want to stress this point because also it's a bit of a mea culpa argument that we historians who've been looking into the integration process have been particularly bad at analyzing the role of law in European integration. And I think this really has to change, and it has changed for good recently, to really look into what this strongly binding character of European law, starting from legislation on to implementation, actually means. And again, more important than looking only within the European institutions, the European communities, is again to compare what again the European Union and community before it was able to do in comparison to other international organizations, such as the Council of Europe, for instance. Again, you will notice if you study the European Union that citizens could already for quite some time appeal to the community directly, which is not the case for other organizations. And that is only one of the elements that shows the legal muscle of this organization, which again furthers and helps to drive integration under circumstances to a deeper level than in other forums. And to keep this brief, I would like to talk already about the third dimension, which is money, if you will. What I mean with this is the larger financial resources that the European communities had in comparison again to other organizations. So what you had here is that already this coal and steel community set up in the early 1950s had its own resources, and since the early 70s this was also true for the European Economic Community. And that meant that it could do other and more things than, for instance, the OECD, where you had money to fund a secretariat and a few expert committees, but little else. And if you go to Strasbourg ever and look into the documents of the Council of Europe, you will see endless complaints about this lack of funds, basically, that there were all these fantastic ideas of what one can do as an organization, but it was simply possible for lack of funds. And this is also where you then see the EC again becoming a more important player, because again, if you bear in mind the first point, this economic logic and economic DNA, it was able to time again argue, well, that things could be seen in an economic way, and hence they could be integrated into the policy fields and the political programs that the European community was doing. If you zoom out to larger questions, you could also say that this is quite in sync with a larger tendency of post-war policymaking in Western Europe, where there is certainly a tendency to commodify and to economize issues that you could also see as very political, right? And to rather look at them through the economic lens and to approach them as if they were economic issues. And again, therefore it was also the zeitgeist, not only the specificities of this organization, that helps to explain why this then was part of the success story of the European communities. Well, this brings me already to the third dimension, and that is again going a little bit beyond the politics and the making of this organization, even if this had to be very abstract, what I've been saying so far, to look a little bit into the question, what did European integration actually bring? Was it productive for people? What kind of were the pros and cons there? And honestly, in writing this book, I was myself surprised to see how little research we have on these various issues. Again, not so much on the politics and the polity and the policies, but rather, again, on what the effects also economically, socially, and so on actually were. If you look back in history, this is different, of course, for the more recent period. So what I do in this book, to give you a little bit of an insight or advertise the book, I have a chapter, for instance, on prosperity. Well, is the EU really a source of prosperity and economic growth? There is something on how does this relate to questions of democracy and to values and to participation. And I thought that it might be nice and also comparably easy to summarize to talk about peace, because that, of course, has always been seen as the main story of European integration. So the question really is that I would like to discuss in the next 5 minutes or so: did the European integration process further peace and help to create a peaceful Europe at the time? And in a nutshell, I think my answer is different from the standard story that you get. And if you will, the standard story is a little bit like this: that post-45 Europe was kind of all destroyed, and then you had these elderly wise men here, not very much in focus, unfortunately. The quality was better when I was looking at it on my laptop, like Konrad Jarausch here, Charles de Gaulle, French president, on the next to him, who then basically said, well, we need to do things differently. We have to work together, we have to cooperate. They were, again, important in building the European communities one way or the other, and hence that this first generation of post-war leaders was understanding that Europe was needed as a common project, that they built Europe, and that there was a peaceful settlement in the early post-war years, but that basically that faded away as generations went on and as the Cold War went on and then was over, and that therefore the peace kind of contribution of the European integration process was biggest in the early years. That is what I would argue is what you often get as a standard story. Now, my argument, as I started to say already, is quite different. I would argue that the European communities were created way too late to really have a systemic impact on questions of peace and war, and that therefore it was not really in the first years that the European integration process made an awful lot of difference when it came to creating peace. Let me briefly elaborate on this argument, and it's not the only argument that I have on peace, so it's not just about kind of kicking the EU out of the window when it comes to this question, if you will. Firstly, I would have to remind us of the Cold War. That is the defining reality of the time. And if you take the Cold War as the main conflict of the time, then it is clear that European integration deepened the conflict, right? It was seen in the Soviet Union, this project of building the European communities, as an addendum, as an annex to the Western alliance. It was seen as a means of German reactionism, of American imperialism, sometimes as a combination of both, even if that might sound quite difficult to combine. But certainly it did deepen the Cold War divide. And if you just for 1 second allow the counterfactual of thinking that the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, would have led to a real fundamental conflict, probably people would have afterwards thought, well, this is the Cold War, this is East and West. But if anyone would ever cared about writing a line on European integration, you can see it as one minor factor that would have continued to deepen the Cold War divide along these lines. Now, if you take the Cold War as a given, you could, of course, say, well, did at least European integration help to strengthen the Western camp in their conflict? And therefore, the early years, the answer would also be probably by tendency no. Because, as we said before, it's only 6 Western European countries that formed this community. And there were quite a few others that were then building another club, a club that I didn't mention so far, EFTA, where the United Kingdom took the lead. And that was, again, an organization that helped to further the divide, if you will, economically, but potentially also politically, within Western Europe. So in that sense, if it's really about the concrete effects of integration, and I could elaborate on this further, I wouldn't say that it is too big. You could, of course, say, well, let's not talk about these conflicts only. Of course, there was the German-French issue, right? And the whole question of German-French reconciliation. And I would argue, yes, of course, the European integration process very much contributed to that. But also there, without the American security guarantee, it would not really have made such a big difference, right? And where it did matter more was really in creating new forums and a new form of finding compromises, creating what I call a new culture of compromise, where it really matters, much more than at many other levels, because there were, again, also these other organizations. For security issues, NATO was much more important, bilateral channels were more important than this organization that in 50s, 60s, 70s was mainly an agricultural policy and a common market, but not so much more, if you will. So in that sense, I think also there it didn't matter too much, with one big exception, and that is, again, lifting the argument, if you will, from realpolitik to some extent, to the symbolic, to the cultural level. I would argue that the European communities became something like the symbolic core of European cooperation, because there were so many diverse efforts and attempts, endeavors to, again, create a peaceful Europe. We didn't have a clear-cut symbol. Again, I was talking about the lack of symbols before, so the irony is that European communities that itself didn't have a real symbol was the symbol of there being new efforts and attempts to create a peaceful Europe. So in that sense, I think it started to matter quite a bit, even if technically and politically, not all the effects that one tends to associate with European integration also really resulted from it. But this is only one half of the story. The second half of the story is really taking us to the second half of the Cold War, and there I would argue, and this is also, again, different to what we have in most textbooks on the story, the European communities did contribute to peace, more importantly than we thought so far. Not so much at the level of international conflicts, if you will, not so much when it comes to the Cold War. Also there, if I had more time, I would talk about that. I would rather concentrate on two main dimensions for this presentation now. Firstly, I would argue that it did something, and that of course implies a different definition of what you mean with peace at the level of social peace. What I mean with this, in a nutshell, that it particularly helped the transition of one sector that had been in crisis for quite some time, agriculture, which had very much contributed to political radicalization in the first half of the 20th century, and the common agricultural policy, which was highly problematic in all kinds of ways, waste of money, waste of time, waste of natural resources, and so on, helped to smoothen that transition of the primary sector to being a sector where 20, 30, 40%, depending on the country, of people were employed, to being a very marginal sector when it comes to its social and economic impact on societies. So in that sense, this is the main point. It was not so much an economic and agricultural policy, it was a hidden social policy, and that is the reason why it creates a social peace at the time. And the second dimension that I want to mention here is then fast forwarding already into the last decade of the Cold War, the 1980s, and not so much the first enlargement round, but the second and third, which is 1981 and 1986, when these Mediterranean countries joined the EC, which were young democracies after decades of dictatorship of the regimes, where again also becoming part of the European community helped to stabilize their democratic regimes. So in that sense, again, it was not the only factor, but it started to become much more than in earlier decades, an important factor in creating peace within a community that was now much bigger than it had been when it had been set up in the 1950s. So if you kind of look a little bit beyond these cases, and if I had more time, I would also talk about the contribution to economic prosperity, values, and so on. My main argument is to say that the 1970s, which many historians so far have seen as the dark ages of European integration, Eurosclerosis is a buzzword that we often use in this context, were actually much more important than we think, right? That there, in this period, European communities actually gained quite some leverage and importance in many different ways, monetary integration being another example, and so on, and that therefore we need to look into that period more specifically. I think I need to slowly come to the end of my presentation, so let me try to conclude already. So the most general lesson that I think we can draw from this history of European integration is to remind us that for a long time there wasn't just one European project, if you will. There wasn't just one European community, but there were many efforts, attempts, institutional fora that were all busy in trying to set up a different form of policy making at the international level for Western Europe, and of course since the end of the Cold War also beyond that. I would also want to argue that it was by no means inevitable that the EC amongst these various organizations would become the most important, the dominant forum of integration. There were some first signs in the 1960s of this, but it was only, I would argue, actually in the second half of the 1980s, after the experiences that I was briefly referring to here, that it did become the most important forum. So just to play with 1 second counterfactual, if you just think for one moment that the Cold War would have ended, say, in 1972 or so, I think it would have been much less likely that the EC of that time would have become the main forum to organize within Europe the transition of the Central Eastern European countries into a new post-communist era. That was only because of the successes of this organization in that period, particularly from the early 1970s into the late 1980s. So also that is a reminder how young, if you will, this organization actually is. And I think that is one of the main messages also, that European integration, well, by historical standards is young anyway, but if you also take the 7 decades of its history, is surprisingly young because, again, many of the competencies, the powers that we associate with it, again, only came to full fruition since the 1980s. So, if you will, this can teach the European Union to some extent humility, or maybe also forbearance, and that is, I think, something that is quite important to bear in mind. The reasons for its rise, I try to elaborate on, again, stressing the economic DNA, the legal muscle, if you will, the financial resources that were particularly important for the organization in times of crisis. Crises such as, of course, the early post-war years, but then particularly the 1970s, when the whole structure of international cooperation in the Western world fell apart with the end of Bretton Woods and so on, and again also with the end of the Cold War. So it was particularly in these moments of crisis that it was able to activate these resources and these means, if you will, that it had. I would, however, also argue that its rise made it actually quite vulnerable, the organization, and this is quite nicely summarized in this Banksy mural that some of you might have seen, which this artist put up in Dover some 2 years ago. What do I mean with this? I was saying that we should contextualize European integration and look at the other forums also. And what I found so interesting in doing that in the research for this book is to see that if you look at the crisis of international organization in those days, in the 1960s, for instance, what you see is that they were often only discussed and unfolded only within one of these forums. So those of you who know the European integration history, the crisis of the empty chair, for instance, didn't really affect international cooperation in the Council of Europe, in NATO, and so on. And when de Gaulle kind of put the plug in NATO, business as usual continued in the EC. And that is quite interesting, that if you will, there was something like firewalls between these international organizations that kept the spark of crisis jumping easily within Western Europe from one to the other. And I would argue that now you have a situation where these various different powers and fields are much more organized under one roof, and that is the one of the European Union. And that makes the EU, on the one hand, very strong and powerful by European standards, but also much more vulnerable, because potentially one could imagine that the spark of crisis could again jump from one of these fields to the other. What I found interesting to talk about present-day developments is Brexit, to the extent that there it was able, the kind of remaining member states were able to keep this quite isolated from other elements of crisis, that there was no spark again moving over, I would argue, to the big questions of migration, to the big questions of the monetary zone and so on. But of course that could still happen in future if another member state chose to leave, if there was other systemic crisis. Again, I would argue that the EU has become more vulnerable because of these kind of combination and culmination of different strands of integration that have now been put under one roof. And that makes it somewhat fragile. Having said that, and this is the last thing, and with the thing with which I would like to end, you could also, that it is still surprisingly resilient. So I first gave you this little kind of part of the kind of painting by Banksy. If you look at the whole thing, you see that, well, yes, he's busy with one of the stars, but the overall picture doesn't really change. And those of you who know the whole story about the flag know that it's always going to be 12 stars, regardless of how many member states you have. And also the overall wall doesn't really change. And if you look at the picture even more, so I think it's really quite sophisticated and interesting. The ladder that we draw here, this is of course just a painting, looks quite wobbly. So the question is, who is more in danger? the whole flag or the guy who's kind of doing the demolishing work. So if you will, I would argue, and this is why I would like to end, that you could also argue that there is a new danger, again, with combining these various forms of European integration under one roof. But I would also want to argue, and this is, I think, what we've also seen over the past years, that the European Union, despite the crisis, despite the drama that I was starting with in my first slide, has been surprisingly resilient and been able to master these various forms of crisis. So those of you who like the European Union maybe have to be less pessimistic than you've been so far, at least if you look at the longer history of European integration. And on the other hand, of course, it doesn't solve the larger crises and challenges that the European Union also has. This is where I would like to end, and I look forward to discussion.